uh, since I come from an Air Force background, the pilots and the other air crew that actually go flying in the combat missions, they're the ones who are directly facing the enemy. There's no, but at the same time, someone needs to keep them safe, just like your car needs breaks down every so often, or you need to take it in and get an oil change and stuff like that. Someone needs to do that for the planes, and that was my job. I was an instrument and electronics technician. I looked after for things like the lighting, the power generation. If I didn't do my job properly, then there's no power to keep the airplane operating in the sky. Uh, Fuel quantity indication. So the pilot knows how much fuel when he's on a mission so that he knows that he's running low on fuel and needs to get back. Things like this. These are very important things. And one of the way I saw the approach is uh, every time the plane went flying and then when it came back and everybody's safe, I did my job right. And so every time the plane went and came back and landed safely, I knew that I had done my job correctly, that I performed my duty to Canadians to ensure that because the loss of a plane and even worse, the loss of people costs a lot to the Canadian government and the Canadians to replace them. So being a technician is very important. One of the when I went to the Gulf War, we were we were exposed to danger. And my grandfather, when he was in England during the war, and he was also an aircraft technician, he had to worry about the Germans bombing the airport that he was on. And when I was in the Gulf, I had to worry about the Saddam Hussein's military attacking the base that I was on. And he did send missiles, just like you see in the news going on in Ukraine. I know what it's like to hear a missile warning go off. I know what it's like to take shelter. Uh, but at the same time, you have to, and I did have this a couple times when had to decide whether it was more important to fix the airplane so it can be ready for its mission or take shelter. And so being in, even though I'm a technician and I'm a long ways behind the front lines, if you want to call it that way, you are still exposed to danger. The 10th of November is National Indigenous Veterans Day. And a lot of the veterans, Indigenous veterans, when they joined the military, some of them literally had to run away from their nations because the government didn't want them to serve. And so in some cases, they actually had to lie about who they were and pretend they were a different ethnicity to be able to serve Canada. And this is partly the acknowledgement. The day is the acknowledgement of that thousands and thousands, and really we don't know, but we know that there were thousands served Canada, Indigenous people that served in the Canadian military. But we have no real idea how many because the government didn't want them to serve, and Canada did not want them to serve, and didn't really recognize them as full Canadian citizens at the time. And when they went away in some cases and were involved in over in Europe in the war and the trenches for years and years and years. And when they came home back to Canada, they were not considered Canadians, and that in the way that, for example, they could not vote and they had to go back to the reserve, and that's where they were expected to leave. Other people coming back from overseas during that serving during the war for those years, when they came back, they would be given help to help build them, whether they were given a small piece of land or some money to go to school or whatever. And the Indigenous population that went and served with them and were exposed to the exact same danger and stuff like that, when they came back, they were given nothing. And they couldn't even vote in the Canadian elections. So to me, November 10th, acknowledging National Indigenous Veterans Day, is an important part of the Truth and Reconciliation task that we have. As I am a settler, I am not Indigenous, and I know that because I've traced my family tree. I know that all my ancestors at some point came, all of them were from Europe, and that none of them were Indigenous. And so for part of my reconciliation is to make sure that on Remembrance Day, I acknowledge the sacrifice that the Indigenous population did in their service for Canadians, and I think that's important that we remember that too. So for me, there's many ways that many different groups of people sacrifice, and it's important that we remember all the people that sacrifice, and not just the ones who were killed in combat, but the people that came back suffering from terrible injuries. The last Canadian to actually die in World War II that was in 1922, 3 years after the war. He is the last Canadian that is recorded in the Book of Remembrance for World War I in 1922, over 3 years after the war was over. He had been suffering from the injuries that he received in the war, and that's when he finally passed away. So, and many other people suffer for many, many years. And that's part of the sacrifice that that happens even in peacetime as well as wartime. That serving Canadians involves sacrifice, not only of loss of time with your loved ones and your family and being away, but it also is hard on your physical health and your mental health. And yes, it's important that we remember all people that have sacrificed for Canadians. When I joined the military, I knew who I was. I didn't quite have the right words to describe who I was, but I knew who I was. And not only that, my parents knew that I was wearing female clothes. And so when I joined the military, my father, who was still in the military at the time, gave me the policy if I was discovered. And basically, the policy said it was that if you're discovered to be gay or trans or non-binary or a lesbian in the military, that the government will dispose of you, that they will kick you out of the military if they discover you. And I was able to hide who I was through my career until the point where they changed the policy. But one of the legacies of that is there's thousands of Canadians whose career in some cases was destroyed by the fact that this happened. And when they were released by the military, after you've been released by the military and you spent 10 years in the military, how do you go and say, well, this is what I did to a new employer if your last job basically fired you? That's not a good thing to have on your resume. So this is one of the legacies of the purge, that there was many people who suffered greatly from it. So that's kind of what the purge was, that if they discovered you, and it was not just in the military, it was also in public servants and stuff like this. And the RCMP also went through this. And so that is one of the legacies of what I am a survivor of. And we think of people who served in war and stuff like that as heroes, but most of us just see ourselves as survivors, not as heroes.